Hi, and welcome to another video. Alan from A Lens on Japan here, and today I wanted to do, I guess, a part 2 of the previous video I posted on my 10-year retrospective of living in Japan. In the previous video I talked about all the good things, and in this one I wanted to kind of do the other side of that, so some of the challenges of living in Japan. And yeah, so let's get right into it. I think the first and kind of the most obvious challenge of living in a country like Japan is going to be the language. It's, if your native language is English, obviously Japanese is very different. Having to learn essentially 3 different writing systems between hiragana, katakana, and kanji, that can take a while, and that's on top of the fact that you also, there's a very clear distinction between casual, kind of normal Japanese, and then also business Japanese. It's just this whole level of difficulty. Even for me, after being here for 10 years basically, there is a it's the high level business Japanese. I still find that very difficult, and not something I'm terribly comfortable with. And that's honestly the case even for a lot of natives. I think they find the business Japanese, essentially the Keiko, like very, very difficult. So that does continue to be a bit of a challenge, I think, almost no matter how long you've been here. The next thing I wanted to talk about is the work culture, and this is kind of infamous, essentially part of Japanese culture. For the most part, everybody knows that, look, working in Japan, you hear stories about overtime and things like that, and for the most part, that is kind of true. The work culture is very different. Especially if what you're used to is the Western work culture. So, you kind of need to be prepared for that and understand like whether that's something you can actually make work or adapt to, or whether you want to do something like just, work for Western companies. But for me, I've been here, as I said, 10 years. I primarily just worked for Western companies because it's a work culture I'm used to. And I have plenty of friends who have worked for Japanese companies, and they tell me about the difficulties they're having, and it just does not necessarily sound like a good fit, at least in my case. So yeah, be aware of that, and understand whether that is something that you're able to adapt to or not, and if not, what are your options outside of that, essentially with Western companies that have a presence in Japan. But yeah, something to be aware of. The other thing, and another, I guess, very obvious thing, is there's always going to be cultural differences. If you were not born here, you're not going to understand 100% of the cultural nuances and things of that nature. So it's something you're always kind of having to learn about. There's always things that, will surprise you. And quite frankly, no matter how long you live here, you're never going to fit in 100%. Because you're not Japanese, basically. You stand out. So just by simple nature of not being Japanese, you will stand out. You will not fit in 100%. But the thing is, that's okay. You don't have to. That as long as, as long as you make the effort to adapt, to learn as much of the culture as you can, to do your best to belong, you are definitely able to do so to a large degree of success as well. So just be aware of the fact that, it doesn't matter how long you're here, you can fit in, and you can fit in very well, but it's never going to be 100% like it is potentially where you're from originally. And that's just how things are. So be okay with that, and you're not going to have many problems. And next, and you see topics on this here and there, whether it's Reddit, whether it's, some other places essentially, but you will hear about, Japan is, discriminates against foreigners, this and that. And does that actually happen? Individual experience will go ahead and vary. In my case, I haven't experienced a lot of it, but I have definitely experienced some of it, to varying degrees. So as a small example, you will notice it like if you're on a train and the train's relatively busy, and let's say I'm sitting down, and there's other empty seats as well. Generally, that people will sit next to other Japanese people. That's not to say all of them, and if there's not that many seats, they'll sit next to you, but you'll notice stuff like that. And obviously it's not everybody that does that, but you know, it's the type of thing that you do see, and it does happen, but you just cannot really let it bother you. The place where I do notice it most, I guess most significantly, is within the real estate industry. I'll do another video on that separately because I do think it deserves to be its own topic. So I'll do a separate video on that. But I've definitely had cases searching for apartments where certain places will tell you, you know, foreigners, like you will call them and ask, oh, is this available? And when you say you're a foreigner, or if the realtor tells them, oh, it's a foreigner, some places will just say, oh, sorry, like this isn't, you know, we do not allow that. What their reasoning is, you know, that can differ. It could be because they have an expectation of, look, we want somebody who is a native Japanese speaker who can understand the documentation, the contracts, etc., etc. But it can be other things as well. Look, who knows? Some people, some landlords maybe have had bad experiences with foreigners and then decided we don't want that. Some maybe just straight up don't want foreigners for whatever, you know, for whatever reason, for some, you know, prejudice or, you know, dislike, or I don't know. But that's kind of the most obvious place where you, I think, will notice it when you're looking for apartments, that there will just be certain places that will straight up reject you for being a foreigner. And even though technically they're not really supposed to do that, as it is discrimination, in most cases, I think it's better to just let it go and look for people that are okay with it. A lot are, I would say, actually most are, so the ones that reject you are in the minority, at least in my experience, but it will happen. And the other part of that, where I've noticed it as well in the real estate industry, is with things like moving out. When you're moving out, the not so great landlords will try to kind of charge you for things that maybe they shouldn't be charging you for, to basically ramp up your move out expenses for things that, you know, should be covered by them, or, you know, basically things that you shouldn't be charged for as a renter. And the assumption on their part is, well, you know, maybe he doesn't understand Japanese law, he doesn't understand his contract, so we're gonna try to take more than we should. And again, that isn't everybody, but I've had a couple of previous landlords basically try that, and as soon as you push back and tell them no, they back off. So clearly it's not something they feel super strongly about, it's just something that they're trying and seeing whether they can get away with it. So yeah, that's where you will notice that most often, at least in my case. I know that there are stories about, you know, police profiling foreigners and stopping for random searches and things like that. I'm sure that happens to some people. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but in my case, in the 10 years I've been here, I've never been stopped by police for any reason, really. So I haven't really had that experience, so I don't really want to, you know, speak on that because I haven't experienced this firsthand. But I do think it does happen to some degree, and I think there's been, you know, videos previously of ex-Japanese policemen basically saying as much, that they're being told to target foreigners in some cases. But I do think, yeah, it's, you know, individual experiences may vary on just how much you're exposed to that. The next thing I want to talk about is this weird thing that honestly surprised even me when I got here, is Japan seems very advanced from the outside. You know, the train systems, you know, you look at Tokyo, it's a very modern city. A lot of technology is really, really of high level, and that is the case in a lot of cases. But in some others, Japan tends to be very antiquated. For example, like fax machines were in use until very, very recently, maybe a few years ago, which to me was just like, wow, I did not think anybody uses this technology or has used this technology for decades at this point. But no, in Japan, it was relatively common until, you know, several years ago. So yeah, you will see kind of those little contrasts between being advanced and very advanced in some way, but also being very antiquated and very kind of old-fashioned in another way, like something as simple as, you know, just being able to pay your rent online or your bills automatically. It's still, to this point, to this day, it's still very kind of inconsistent. Like, some companies will support it, some will not. For some, it's a very antiquated process, like you have to send in a physical form, like a paper form, by mail to do it, instead of just being able to do it online, or you know, sort of set it up in a time when you move in or something like that. So things like that just feel like, you know, why is this done this way? This could be so much more efficient, so much more streamlined, and yet it's not. So there's things like that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is all sort of tied to moving and your living space. It's especially in Tokyo, I suppose, and I want to preface this that this is specific to Tokyo and the bigger cities, is places are going to be very small compared to the US. And you know, I used to live in a 1,700 square foot house in Arizona and had a front yard, backyard, pool, all that other stuff, and I was paying very little by today's standards. In Tokyo, I pay significantly more than that for significantly less in terms of space, and that's just something you have to get used to. The price of real estate is relatively high, especially considering other parts of Japan. And if you're outside of Tokyo, it's not as much. You can definitely find things much, much cheaper, but in Tokyo specifically, you're going to kind of have to make some compromises on the size. So that's something definitely to get used to, especially if you're used to a big kitchen. Like, big kitchens in Tokyo are just, for the most part, not a thing. My kitchen right now is pretty tiny, but Japanese people tend to be very efficient with use of space, so you can find a way to maximize it. But you know, I'm not gonna have an island kitchen or anything like that in Tokyo, and very few people will, unless you have your own house somewhere. So kind of, that's, you know, that's again another thing to get used to, and figure, you know, you need to figure out like where you're willing to compromise. And on that same topic, things like the moving process I mentioned is very, very annoying. It's very expensive to move in Japan because of just the process itself, all the fees involved and everything. And like I said, I'll do a separate video on that. And also, if you have a pet, especially in Tokyo, like your selection of potential apartments where you can kind of move into is going to be much, much smaller. For a city that, you know, I thought was very pet friendly, the amount of pet friendly properties tend to be very small, especially in cases where you have a dog, or you know, that's more than the kind of smallest breeds, under like 10 kilograms or so. Medium and large sized dogs is, you know, even rarer and even more difficult to find apartments that allow that. So I think I'll stop there. I could go into a lot of smaller things, but for right now, I think those are some of the bigger ones. If you would like to hear some of the other things in future videos, please let me know and I can go ahead and do that. But I'll leave it there for the time being. For the next video, I might actually talk a little bit more about the discrimination issue within that real estate industry specifically, because I do have some stories on that front. And if you're looking to move to Japan and live in Japan, it's something you should probably be aware of before you make that decision and start your search. But for the time being, I'll stop there. So if you like this video and want to see videos like this, or you know, videos on any other topic tied to Japan, please leave a comment and like and subscribe, so that I can continue to hopefully get enough support to continue doing this. Because yeah, I do think there are a lot of topics I want to cover, but I also want to make sure I cover things that people are actually interested in. So if you watched this far, I thank you so much, and I'll see you in the next video. But for now, bye from Tokyo. またね。